We'll go to our next speaker. This was reminding me of, there's a great, Michael Pollan appeared on Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, and the comedian Paula Poundstone tried to explain to him that a ring ding had a limited number of ingredients, just cake, filling, and icing. And so it was clearly a health food because it only had 3 major ingredients. But maybe we should have ours the entertainment tomorrow. But anyway, our next speaker is journalist Tamar Haspel. You're hooked up. Okay.
Two seconds. Now you can hear me. Now I can hear me. Now that we've had marketing, we're going to move on to media. This is like the rotten fruit section of the program. And so far, we've heard from a lot of people who manage the information on how we make decisions, who study it, professionals, academics, scientists. I'm a consumer of that information because it's part of my job. Oh, thank you. It's part of my job to have the clicker. And so I'm going to talk about what the challenges are for journalism in the light of what we're learning about how we make decisions and how I try and deal with it in my work. I have a column in the Washington Post. I write about food supply issues and basically anywhere where food and science intersect. So because we're dealing with cutting-edge science, I thought I'd go back 100 years for a relevant quote. This is good old Ambrose Bierce. Brain, the apparatus with which we think. And we've heard a lot about that already. I'm going to just go through some basics. Jonathan Haidt is one of the scientists who studies this. And his book, The Righteous Mind, has a very powerful metaphor. And he takes us through how we think we make decisions. We analyze facts and we come to a conclusion. But how we really make decisions is that we all have an elephant. And his metaphor is the elephant and the rider. And I think it's a very powerful and sticky one, which is why I use it all the time. All of us have an elephant and we have a rider. And our elephant is a sum total of our intuitions, our emotions, our cultural affiliations, our values, all of those things that are essentially not quite innate, but that are operating below the level of our rational mind. And as soon as an issue comes down the pike, fracking, GMOs, our elephant knows exactly what he thinks about it, or she. I guess we can have female elephants too. It either thinks, hey, this is a great idea. I love the idea that we'll be able to feed more people more efficiently. Or, ick, this is a terrible idea. We're taking genes from one species and putting them in another. And once our elephant has turned one way or the other, it's very hard to get your elephant to change course because, it's an elephant. And so the rider is in charge of coming up with all of the rational reasons that the elephant was right in the first place. Because it's much easier to rationalize the elephant's movement than it is to change the elephant's movement. And we're all like that. And they're different layouts of the same kind of idea, thinking fast and slow. System 1 and System 2 are exactly analogous to the elephant and the rider. I prefer the elephant and the rider. But anybody read Thinking Fast and Slow? Anyone read The Righteous Mind? Yeah, The Righteous Mind, I actually prefer it, but this lays out some of the same reasons. But David Hume was on it 300 years ago. Reason is slave to the passions. And one of the reasons I bring up Ambrose Bierce and David Hume is that we are codifying this idea of how we analyze risk and how we make decisions in a very scientific way. But the observation of this is very old. And the Romans had things to say about this too. The idea that we are not nearly as rational as we'd like to think we are is very old, and it's borne out over and over again. Confirmation bias, and you've already seen some information on this, so I won't go through it in depth. Confirmation bias rules the human psyche, and it does it in 2 ways. We can do this actively, where we seek out people who confirm what it is that we want to believe. We do this with our media, and now that we're in charge of our media in a much more personal way, and we have social media streams, it becomes that much easier. So we get to surround ourselves with people who will continue to tell us the things which we want to be true. But the more diabolical way that confirmation bias works is that it helps us filter out anything that comes our way that conflicts with what we want to believe. And you've seen stuff already, and I won't go into it in great detail, but there are two issues that I think we have to keep in mind. Number one is that when we hear facts that disconfirm our beliefs, not only do we not believe it, it can sometimes make us dig in our heels and believe our original belief even more strongly. And number two, and this is really important, and Dan cited some empirical work on this, that we evaluate the credibility of experts based on the extent to which they agree with us. And this is pretty scary, because it basically allows us to have a worldview in which the only credible people are the people who share our worldview. And it becomes very difficult to find a way to change your mind. And one of the things that we hear a lot, and we hear it from Neil deGrasse Tyson, the great thing about science is that it's true whether you believe it or not. And that's true. But it's a little more slippery than that. And I don't know if you guys know Doug Gurian-Sherman and Kevin Folta. They're both PhDs. They're both very involved in genetically modified organisms and the science that surrounds them. They have both said this to me verbatim. I'm not pro-GMO. I'm not anti-GMO. I follow the science and go where it leads me. Yet it has led them to diametrically opposed positions. Doug is essentially very concerned about what he sees as threats to the environment and the risks associated with genetically modified foods. Kevin is an outspoken advocate for their safety and the continuing their use. And the point here is not that either of them is right or wrong. The point here is that in the history of mankind, there's never been anyone who held a position that he didn't think was science-based. And so we have this idea that, okay, well, we understand the science. If only we can communicate what we know to these other people, they'll change their minds. But that's not how the dynamic works. And lots of people have talked today, Dominique and Bill and Dietram this morning, about that very same idea. Now, personally, I think it's a stroke of genius to use Dan Kahan's data at a meeting where Dan Kahan is presenting before me on the agenda. I did recognize the risk, but I left it up here anyway because I think this is a very, very important graph. This is everything that's scary about science communication. And of course, the idea that GMOs are not as polluted yet is an important one. But education doesn't protect you either. I don't know if you saw this study. It just came out, I think it was a few weeks ago. And this was studied about current events, not so current, so the Iraq War, the Afghanistan troop surge. And they asked people factual questions about those things. And what they found out was that if you're more educated, it doesn't give you a more accurate framework in which to process a fact. What it gives you is a very sophisticated mechanism to filter out what you don't want to hear. And so take a moment to read this. Educated citizens possess the cognitive skills to reject facts inconsistent with prior dispositions. The most educated partisans are furthest apart in their factual understanding. And this is just another version of Dan Kahan's graph on climate change. Facts can be slippery, and this is again, these are things that feed into this idea that we have the science-based understanding, and if only we can convey that. But I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the work of John Ioannidis. He studies the problems with peer-reviewed science, often in the medical area, but in other areas too, and that most of what gets peer-reviewed and published actually turns out to be false. So if we have a mechanism, no, I see you shaking your head. You should read you should read the paper. But the fact that we have this sophisticated filtering mechanism, and it's compounded by the fact that a lot of what actually gets published as fact is not fact, it's hard to see your way home. Mark Twain saw his way home. There's something fascinating about science when it gets such wholesale returns of conjecture out of such trifling investment of fact. And we all do this. We all take the facts that we believe to be facts and use them to scaffold up our worldview. And I was out in the Pacific Northwest. I was going to an aquaculture conference in Oregon, and I heard a story on NPR about a guy who was starting a museum in Boise. It's called it's the Northwest Science Museum. And he talked about how the public is being underserved by the presentation of science, and he was going to start this science museum devoted to New Earth creationism, where he presented the science, the evidence, the artifacts, and he wanted people to decide for themselves because they just weren't seeing the complete picture. And so again, it goes back to this idea that everybody believes that the facts support their position. So if facts aren't persuasive, how do we communicate about science? It's my job to communicate facts about science. So the fact that communicating facts about science is useless, sometimes you just want to go back to bed. But what I want to focus on here is that when we see all of these data, we look at all these charts, we listen to these compelling scientists, and there's a temptation to shake your head and think about what a shame it is that so many other people think this way. And it's very hard to get your arms around the idea that we, all of us, are guilty of the same thing. It's not guilt. This is just how the human mind is wired. And it makes sense that it is. I mean, we evolved in an absence of data. We evolved to depend on the cues around us and our cultural affiliations. It would make sense that we have primordial mechanisms to allow us to keep doing that. And that we can incorporate data at all is something of a miracle. But, so, all right, how do we deal with this? If I'm a journalist and I have these questions, but you have the same questions because you want to parse data accurately, you want to understand issues, you want to communicate persuasively. The only difference is that I face public humiliation when I get it wrong. And so I went through this step of trying to really understand my own biases, and it's painful and difficult, so I'm going to make you do it. And I don't know. So if we want to talk about how to be better communicators, for me, the very first step is to be persuaded. And we have to wrangle our own elephants before we can start thinking about other people's. So I want to ask you a couple of questions. The first, I guess I don't have to ask. If I were to ask you, do you think you're right about everything? Nobody would say they are. But then if I were to ask you, well, what are you wrong about? And you start taking inventory of all your positions, and damned if they don't seem spot on. Every single one. Yet, if you were to pick apart your neighbor's positions, you could spot the inconsistencies very quickly. And so motivated reasoning is always sort of something that other people do. And it's very hard to grasp our own, because it's the whole business of being subconscious is subconscious. And your mind doesn't have access to your elephant, and you have to take it on faith that you have one. And it's a very difficult thing to do. So even if you're right about 97% of the things that you think, that means 3% you're wrong about. Okay, 3% is a low number, but you don't know which 3. And so it's really, really hard to sort of get used to the idea that you're wrong about things. And so let me ask you, in the last year, raise your hand if you've changed your mind on a substantive issue. All right, we got some. Fred, what's yours?
On GM stuff.
On what?
On some GM issues.
Which one specifically?
Can't talk about that right now.
Who's got another one? I want to hear them.
Bed sharing with your baby.
Bed sharing, did you go in which direction?
I went towards maybe it's okay in some situations.
Did you have a baby?
I did.
Hey. And that is a really, really good example, because what happened was not having more facts. What happened was having, yeah, okay, but you had the baby. I would argue that people without babies are much less likely to change their opinions on that particular subject. Anybody else? Yeah.
Fracking.
On fracking, which way did you go?
I thought it was. I'm moving. I've reassessed that. I think there's more risk now than I previously did.
Okay, and the way you describe that is really interesting, because it gets at another very important point, and that is most of the time our minds don't get changed in an aha moment where somebody says, this canola has what percent more oil? 30% more oil, which I think is a very compelling thing. And you may not say to somebody, this canola has 30% more oil, and they change their minds. However, it is possible that they store that away, and then they hear more facts that might be relevant to this, and then slowly minds change. So the idea that we go out and expect people's minds to change, in an evening or in a discussion is unrealistic. Second is to reconsider bias. It's not something that's bad and only bad scientists and bad journalists have. As a journalist, I have to accept that every expert I talk to has a bias. My readers have a bias. I have a bias. And I have to try and negotiate all of those things in order to try and arrive at what the truth of the story is. And there was an exchange in the media between Brad Plumer, who writes for Vox, and me, because he wrote a story about what's responsible for oil prices going down. Now, how many of you were around when oil prices were going up in 2012 and had a discussion about the role that speculators play in oil prices? Anybody read a media story about that, have a discussion about that? A lot of people did. Have you seen any discussions about the role of speculators now that oil prices are going down? Has anyone reached out to thank the Oh, you have? Oh, I haven't. That's good. And so when our ox is being gored, when we're getting hit in the pocketbook by the idea of we have to pay more for gas, it's very easy to blame somebody else. But when it's a benefit, it's not so easy. I wouldn't have seen it, except I'm married to an oil speculator. So these fluky effects I didn't mean to put in there. So vet your sources and manage your media. This is key to what I do. But again, if everyone's got a bias, how do you go about vetting your source? And it's overwhelmingly tempting to think that sources are credible when they agree with me. So how do you try and figure out what's a credible source and what isn't? And I actually do have sort of an acid test. It doesn't always work. But in any kind of complex issue like genetic modification, most scientific issues, fracking, for example, there are going to be pluses and minuses. There are going to be compelling arguments on both sides. There are going to be issues that speak for and against. And for me, I look for a source that acknowledges both pluses and minuses. If you see that your source is only listing the assets or only listing the liabilities, chances are they've got an ideological dog in the fight. And that doesn't mean they're wrong. It just means that you need to understand that. And manage your media as well. We determine what we hear by figuring out who's in our Twitter stream. Look at your Twitter stream. Are there people on both sides of the GMO debate in your Twitter stream? Make sure that there are. Follow the smartest people on the other side. And follow me, of course. And part of, if acknowledging both risks and benefits is part of what makes a source credible, well, by God, you should acknowledge both risks and benefits, because that is part of how, not just you seem reasonable, because that makes it sound like it's phony baloney, but that is part of how you are reasonable, how you become reasonable. And my goal in my work is to become a source that people trust, and Dominique talked about trustworthiness. And part of how I do that is to really try hard to see the other side of the coin. And one of the things that I do in order to do that is I try and find the absolute smartest people I know who disagree with me, and I call them up and I ask them questions, and then I listen. Some of you probably know Ricardo Salvador at the Union of Concerned Scientists. He's a really smart guy, and he and I have had long, long conversations because his worldview is different from mine in a lot of ways. And two things happen when you do this. Number one is that you get the best argument on the other side of the coin. But number two is you change. We're so used to having disagreements with people who we just think are wrong about things. And to have a conversation with somebody who you really respect, who you think is really smart, you find yourself tempering your own opinions and maybe not coming down as hard and maybe being a little more open-minded. I'm sure most of you saw that the excellent Amy Harmon story on citrus greening in the New York Times last year. It was a great example of how journalism can be persuasive. And we can have the discussion about the extent to which journalism ought to be persuasive, because presumably we are reporting facts. But I think any journalist will tell you that we do want to bring people in from the fringes, if not persuade them to a particular position. And one of the reasons that story was so good was that it was a story. It told the story not just of a plant, but of the people whose livings depend on those plants and how they're struggling with those issues. And it was very compelling. I wrote a piece about the American chestnut and the potential return of the American chestnut. People found that compelling also. It's all it's a framing issue. Okay, if we can talk about these organisms in a way that isn't just about Roundup Ready soy, maybe we can move the needle on these things. But perhaps the biggest thing you can do is reach across the aisle. And again, this goes back to the idea that we evaluate credibility based on the extent to which people agree with us. So if you are a staunch GMO supporter, you're not going to have much luck persuading a staunch GMO opponent. But if you take somebody from that person's cultural affiliation who might agree on other issues like fracking and climate change and nuclear power, and if you can reach over to an influencer who is more closely aligned with GMO opponents, and you can have a conversation, then that person can persuade their constituency. And so I'm pretty convinced that the key to peace in our time on this issue is getting people with various points of view all in a room together. And there's a tendency for the organic people to have the organic conference and the biotech people to have the biotech conference. And we need to interbreed, not figuratively, but not literally, but figuratively. And we need to be talking to each other, because minds don't get changed when people stand up and give presentations. Minds get changed when you go out for a beer and you find out that you both have kids in soccer, or you both like to canoe. And those are the conversations we need to be having. And we need to be having them with people who disagree with us, because we have to acknowledge that the brain is really just the organ with which we think we think. So thank you very much. Questions, comments? Rotten
Yes,
fruit.
someone else who finished exactly on time. Questions?
I'm Bruce Lewinstein from Cornell. Tamar, thanks. That was really great. I teach science journalism, so part of what I have to do is teach people to try to do these things. And I guess in some ways, I'm also depressed by all the stuff we've heard today, though I've known it for a while, so I've been depressed for a long time. But I guess what I'm still trying to figure out is how we take these ideas and implement them in a way that leads to, in a real world where there's limited resources, limited time. The amount of time it took Amy Harmon to do that citrus story is the amount of time very few reporters are going to have the resources to do that. we've heard about the challenges of reframing, the fact that we're often responding to perceptions of perceptions, and organizations are, and they have their own, as Steve was pointing out, they have their own rationales that are often, these are economically productive ways of doing things. I'm trying to figure out what the next, sort of on a daily basis, what are the things that one can actually do?
I think it depends who one is. And, if you're a journalist, that's the question that I live and die by. And I sort of outlined some of the strategies that I use. If you're a scientist, think about what those might be for you, because I'm not convinced that they're the same for everybody. And part of this, and part of the reason that I want to really stress that we all do this, and it's not just something the other guy does, is that once you're convinced that you are subject to these biases, it helps you take a kinder, gentler view of people, of positions that aren't yours, and of people who have those positions. And if we go out in general with the idea that we're just as prone to make mistakes as anybody else, it does help temper the discussion. And that's a very personal thing, and it's not easy to do, or at least it's not easy for me. And but that would be my number one suggestion.
Roger's got a question.
Yeah, it's mostly a comment, but maybe a question. That was great, by the way.
Thank you.
I'm going to push back a little bit about this tenor of being depressed in hearing this, because, on the one hand, this is how the Enlightenment's supposed to work.
You're right.
We learn stuff, and even if it comes from the social sciences, it gives us new option to think about how to interact in the world. And I guess my question is, isn't this notion of being depressed, hearing about this, just a longing for a world of rationality that you explained doesn't exist, but that we wish exist? But it's so dominant in our thinking, in the institutions that we have.
It is.
And I guess I wonder, as a reporter, what's your experience when you write about these things? Do you get pushback from people with the hardcore Enlightenment rationality model that says all you're doing is letting the bad guys, whoever they are, into the room, giving them legitimacy?
Can I add one thing?
Yes.
So while you're answering that, the way Roger puts it, one could also argue that while acknowledging that it may be, a folly that even the moral philosophers of the Scottish Enlightenment understood, it's actually important that continue to be the wish, right? So what happens if we get so good at this that that's no longer the ideal? So that's another.
I think we're far enough away from that so that I'm going to put that on the back burner. But the question of pushback, there are a couple of things that have happened that I thought have been interesting. When I write about these things, the tenor of the comments on the article tends to be a lot like what you say. And I get the bifurcated comments where, if I say anything good about GMOs, the pro-GMO, the anti-GMO guys say you're an idiot. If I say anything bad, the pro-GMOs guys say you're an idiot. It's like reporting on the Middle East. If you're not pissing off everybody, you're doing something wrong. But what's interesting is that I get a lot of private correspondence, letters to me, and those have completely different tone, except for the one that compared me to Hitler and wished me a slow, painful death. A lot of the letters I get are thoughtful, appreciative, and I get some that say that something I've written has actually moved the needle, and those really make my day. And the question I've always wondered about is, so why do the appreciative, nuanced ones come privately, and the bashing ones are public? And I think that it's kind of an interesting and unfortunate indicator. But I'm not that depressed. We're not headed for a rational society, but I think we could be headed for one where we recognize this whole idea of recognizing that bias is part of the human condition rather than a shortcoming in a scientist would go a long way toward doing that.
Last question.
Hi, Trevor Butterworth, Sense About Science USA, which is about to launch very soon, AAAS. I was very heartened to see a quote from David Hume. One of my favorite observations about David Hume came from the historian Roy Porter, who said that journalism cured Hume of his depression because he saw journalism as a new way of doing philosophy. Now, the standard model of journalism in the last 30-odd, 40 years has been avoid numbers at any cost. Ryan and Tankard and Ryan, who did the early research on how journalism covered science, said journalists just either believed all numbers or ignored them completely. One of the really interesting developments that's happening in tandem, I think, with the transition from computational to data-intensive science is the awareness and importance of numbers. You see that somewhat in the rise of explainer and wonk journalism. But you also see other massive shifts, which is that in tandem with technology, anybody can be a journalist today, and people like the GIFSAN hired a former Washington Post reporter to help them with stories. Microsoft and GE are doing really groundbreaking journalism on their own, whereas once they would have gone to you as a gatekeeper. So there are huge opportunities to develop new ways of communication, along with an extraordinary awareness that for so long journalism has been getting science wrong, and that actually a more data-sensitive journalism is the answer to that.
I think that's a very interesting point, and obviously journalism has evolved in the last couple of decades, probably more than it had in a couple of centuries. And but of course, with the attention to data, sometimes data can tell the wrong story even more compellingly than print can, and so the same questions about credibility apply. Because, I mean, sometimes graphs, in fact, generally, I believe the science will back me up on this, that people find graphs more compelling than print. They remember them. And so it's a double-edged sword. But I do believe that it has a good side as well.
Great, thank you very much. Saying journalism has evolved in the last little while is the nicest way I've ever heard it put. But I'm wondering if there's an age bias in the letters versus email responses.
You're on, so don't say anything
But
foolish.